Good day. My name is Hannes Knoetze and I'm teaching missiology at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria. My research field of speciality is poverty alleviation or missional diaconate. I also do research on the African millennial generation, and lately I also work a lot on theological education in Africa. Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper to you today. And the topic I want to present to you is opportunities and challenges of theological education and missional formation in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a paradigm shift. When addressing opportunities and challenges of theological education and missional formation, it is important to take note of what Ott is saying. He says, "How can I write a module descriptor before I have listened to you? Your experiences will influence what we are going to do in this course." Close the quote. When writing from a South African perspective about the challenges and opportunities of theological education in Africa, listening is essential, as we have started teaching and doing theology in Africa without really listening. It is also important to note that the first institution for formal theological education commenced with St. Mark in Alexandria, Egypt, in Africa. Tawik is writing, St. Mark established this school in Alexandria, Egypt, as the earliest and most important institution of theological education in Christian antiquity. It encouraged the spirit of research and religious studies and contributed to establishing the first system of theological studies in the whole world. It was indeed the cradle of the Christian theology, which brought forth great men who resisted the heresies of their age and dazzled the world with their deep faith and eloquence. Within this short remark of the commencement of institutionalized or formal theological education, we find three important aspects of or characteristics of theological education. The first noteworthy characteristic is the spirit of research. It is clear that from the very beginning, research and theological education belong together. We may not be involved in theological education if we are not involved in research. And we may not be involved in research if it does not benefit theological education. This is one of the biggest modern day challenges and opportunities for theology. We have come a long way with research, and our research helps us to discover and know God in new ways in different circumstances. But I will attend to this when I discuss the paradigm shifts later on. The question is, how does our research influence our teaching? The second important characteristic was the establishment of the first system of theological studies. In my understanding, this refers inter alia to the curricula that are taught within the African context, but also global Christianity. This is one of the many opportunities and challenges of theological education. The question is the system of separate theological disciplines still applicable for our day and age, or do we need a new system? For example, must we teach the 6 theological disciplines in silos, or must we teach a more holistic and integrated theology? And what about the interdisciplinary work where theological education should emerge from the academic ivory towers to create flexible and adaptable spaces for theological development and living faith that can make the universal Christian ideals a reality? This also links to the third important characteristic of theological education, namely to bring forth men and women who resisted the heresies of their age and dazzled the world with their deep faith and eloquence. This reflects not only on the information that is transferred in theological education, but also on the formation of the students. In essence, it is impossible to separate theological education and spiritual formation. The challenge is, how do we include spirituality and how do we assess spirituality within a higher education institution? In discussing the opportunities and challenges of theological education within a global context, which in the context of this article is focusing on Africa, African traditional religion, other living faiths, post-Christendom, illiteracy, traditionalism, secularization, and the fourth industrial revolution, we need to be aware of at least the following three issues. First, we need to re-examine some methodological aspects of our curriculums. These might include, but are not limited to, teaching methods, modes of delivery, and how to bring the Bible as normative text into curriculum design of the current realities. The second aspect I would call human, student, and educator-centered awareness, or it can also be called knowledge constitutive interest. This implies that neither the student nor the educator is standing outside the education process, but they are an integral part of the education process as persons with all their experiences, concerns, and hopes. Both educators as well as students have implicit expectations regarding the outcomes of theological education. However, in many instances, these expectations are firmly influenced by the church or a specific denomination and by a specific education institution. The third aspect of theological education has to do with the fact that theological education does not take place out there, but is a life-transforming and very personal issue that has to do with a praxis, a way of life. When attending to the challenge and opportunities of theological education as missional formation in the fourth industrial revolution, the following are important questions to answer. How can theological education become an integral part of the life of the church in a way that the church will come to greater missional maturity? How can the life of the church and the students become part of the curriculum development in such a way that their experiences and reflections can contribute to the decolonization and contextualization of the curriculum, to equip the church and society to make God's kingdom a greater reality in this world? If we come now to a paradigm shift, according to Oliver, the church is not only experiencing the influence of COVID-19 and the fourth industrial revolution, but also the fourth communication revolution and the fourth revolution in self-understanding. I quote Oliver, "People no longer believe that our world is immobile or at the center of the universe, that is the Copernican revolution, or that people are totally separate and different from the rest of the animal kingdom, that is the Darwin revolution, and that we have Cartesian minds that are thoroughly transparent to ourselves, that's the Freudian or neuroscientific revolution." Floridi concludes that we are informational organisms, mutually connected and embedded in an informational environment, the infosphere, which we share with other informational agents, both natural and artificial. Close the quote of Oliver. Oliver mentions that Floridi might be viewed as the father of the fifth revolution in self-understanding. However, in my view, this was always the self-understanding of the African people and other tribes or nations in the majority world. that they were mutually connected. Just think of the Ubuntu principle in Africa. Might it be that again academics from the West and North are not taking Africa or the majority world serious? Regardless, the point I want to make is that Christianity is experiencing different revolutions which bring about paradigm shifts. For this article, I will work with the paradigm theory of Thomas Kuhn and as described by Bosch. It is therefore presupposed to be a limited perspective on a difficult concept, but I believe it will help us in our ongoing discussion with a clear understanding that Christian theology is always contextual, and with the theological education happening on all 6 continents on earth, it is clear that our views of education and theology are only perceptions. Our perceptions or interpretations are deeply shaped by our self-understandings and our context. None of us enters education, even more so theological education, as a clean slate, and no one is passively involved in teaching and learning. Each one of us always reinterprets what we teach to an audience or what we hear in our own self-understanding and context. For this reason, it is suitable to talk about theological educations. To complicate it even more, there is also not only one theology, but many different theologies. All individual understandings are conditioned by a variety of personal factors, including culture in religion and religious experiences. Therefore, an individual's self-understanding will play a crucial role in his or her receptivity of theological education. Another important and related factor is the context or frame of reference in which a student has grown up. This includes his or her experience and understanding of reality, history, and his or her family, as well as context and continent within the universe. It is in this regard that Bosch is using the paradigm shift theory of Thomas Kuhn to describe paradigm shifts in the mission history of the Church. With the acknowledged shift of Christianity from the North and the West to the global world, and more specifically the South, I am convinced a new paradigm shift is taking place, especially regarding theological education. From native Africans, there are serious calls for a paradigm shift of decolonization and or Africanization of theological education, although not only of the theological education, but also of education on the African continent in general. Bosch acknowledged some limits to the paradigm shift theory of Kuhn, but stated that he used it only as a kind of working hypothesis, as will be done in this paper. Kuhn argues that science does not grow cumulatively, but by way of revolutions. It starts when reality is perceived in ways qualitatively different from previous or contemporary normal science. Therefore, no individual or group can actually create a new paradigm. Rather, it grows and ripens within the context of an extraordinary network of diverse social and scientific factors. As the existing paradigm increasingly blurs, the new one begins to attract more and more scholars, until eventually the original problem-ridden paradigm is abandoned, according to Bosch. Now, hence a paradigm shift is always a struggle, since it is not simply taking a rational or scientific step. As argued before, there is no objective knowledge. People and their emotions are involved in the shift from one paradigm to another. A paradigm can be defined as the entire constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and so on shared by the members of a given community. If we accept this definition by Bosch, it becomes clear that Christianity is experiencing a paradigm shift and African Christianity will influence the rest of the world. Other names for a paradigm shift mentioned by Bosch are models of interpretation, or frames of knowledge, or frames of reverence, or research traditions, or belief systems. Being aware of these synonyms, the impact and implications of a paradigm shift in theological education to a decolonized or Africanized paradigm become clear. In 2014, Branston and Knoetze conducted research on theological education at the Northwest University in South Africa. The conclusion of their research was that attention needs to be given to contextualization, worldviews, and hermeneutics. And now I quote the author's indication. By recognizing, acknowledging, and accepting one's own context, one can begin to realize that a few alterations are not sufficient, but a completely new hermeneutical key is needed to be relevant to the new ancient future worldview in the context of Africa. A paradigm shift in theology is different from a paradigm shift in natural science, in the sense that old paradigms never completely disappear and can even revive in time. However, this indicates that all theology is partial and culturally and socially biased. This, however, does not imply that theology or theological education is relative. Just that it is contextual and that it cannot be made logically or even probabilistically compelling for those of a different context. As such, there is a creative tension between my ultimate faith commitment and my own theological perception, according to Bosch. He then continues, and I quote, "For the Christian, this means that any paradigm shift can only be carried out on the basis of the gospel and because of the gospel. Never, however, against the gospel. Contrary to natural science, theology relates not only to the present and the future, but also to the past, to tradition, to God's primary witness to humans. Theology must undoubtedly always be relevant and contextual, but this may never be pursued at the expense of God's revelation in and through the history of Israel and supremely the event of Jesus Christ. Christians take seriously the epistemological priority of their classical text, the scriptures." Close quote. In this regard, the World Church functions as an international hermeneutical community in which different theologies or theological educations challenge each other's biases. Important is that we see our fellow believers not as opponents or rivals, but as brothers and sisters seeking the truth with us. Hence, a paradigm shift of decolonization and Africanization at the Faculty of Theology is at least threefold. First, to address content, African contextualization. Second, models of delivery, open distance learning or online teaching. Thirdly, program and qualification mix diversity, PQM, new programs, diplomas and certificates, not only degrees. Collectively, this threefold approach puts a Faculty of Theology in the South African context with a history of more than 100 years in a transition phase, and may I say, it contributes to a paradigm shift. So now we go to the global church with the missional hermeneutic. One of the biggest challenges to the church in the global world is theological education and the way in which we use the Bible. In Africa, 85% of all pastors, priests, or ministers have no official or recognized theological education or training. The question is, how do we conceive pastors, priests, and ministers the question is, how do we convince pastors, priests, and ministers that they need theological education? There are many arguments based on biblical texts that are used by one group to convince people of the importance of theological education, but another group has just as many texts to inform people that theological education is not necessary. If we trust in God, He will take care, and the Spirit will give us the message. To responsibly address this dilemma, we need to move beyond the so-called biblical foundation for or against theological education, because irrespective of what our arguments are, we have already decided what we want to prove, and our selection of texts will simply confirm our opinions. This article is written from the understanding that theological education is a missionary activity of the church, with the implication that theological education will contribute to the transforming lives to become disciples of Christ. However, it must be stated clearly that theological educators must always be aware of their own denominational bias, especially in a higher education institution where ecumenical theology is taught. The denominational bias of the controlling group may never contribute to or promote disunity or fragmentation among Christians. From the example of the church in Africa, it is important to realize that the missional hermeneutic needs to include the recognition of the multiplicity of perspectives and contexts from where people are reading the Bible. This includes the decolonization and Africanization debates. But this may not lead to relativism. It is important to point out here that plurality in interpretation is not pluralism as a hermeneutical ideology, nor is it a relativistic charter, according to Wright. It is from the perspective of theological education as a form of discipleship that I want to use Wright's description of missional hermeneutic as a unifying methodology and language and apply it to theological education to enable the different disciplines to converse meaningfully with one another. Working with a missional hermeneutic, I am convinced the different disciplines will be able to create new theological knowledge that will enhance the students' experience of the discipline and thereby contribute to their calling and understanding of the implications of the Bible for the church and society in their context. From a missional hermeneutic of diversity, we need to move to a missional hermeneutic of coherence. Within the context of diversity, what does it mean to speak the truth in love? Wright uses Luke chapter 24 to answer this question and explain his understanding of missional hermeneutics, and I quote, "Nevertheless, the words of Jesus opened their minds so they could understand the scripture." Luke 24 verse 45. In other words, Jesus himself provided the hermeneutical coherence within which all disciples must read these texts. That is, in the light of the story that leads up to Christ. That's a messianic reading, and the story that leads on from Christ, a missional reading. That is the story that flows from the mind and purpose of God in all the scriptures for all the nations. That is a missional hermeneutic of the whole Bible. Close the quote. From this quote and the above, we can agree that theological education should include the academic, the pastoral skills development, and the required spirituality. However, we ought to know that there are different ways of integrating theological training. One size does not fit all. It requires intentional planning with all stakeholders, so that all goals are aligned from course, purpose to program as well as institutional goals. To ensure a missional hermeneutic that is contextualized in a global world, we need a Trinitarian foundation of theological education to make it clear that God and not the Church is the primary subject and source of liberating theological education. Where a missional hermeneutic founded in the Trinitarian God parts company with radical postmodernity is in its insistence that through all this variety, locality, particularity, and diversity, the Bible is nevertheless actually the story. This is the way it is. This is the universal story that gives a place in the sun to all the little stories, according to Wright. I quote Ott again, saying, in a certain way, it is stupid to call a lecture too theoretical. It depends on which kind of theory it transmits. And what I do with this story, which previously knowledge and experience I bring to this lecture, and how I construct my functioning or applied theory as I listen to the lecture and reflect my life and work. Close the quote. Theological institutions in Africa are often accused of being too theoretical in their education. And students do not know how to minister to congregations in different contexts. Accusations like these ask for reflection on the relation between theory and practice, or praxis. In my theological training institution, in any theological training institution, especially those at higher education institutions like universities, the lecturers have most probably studied theology in a classic format with at least the traditional fourfold curriculum of biblical studies, church history, systematic theology, and practical theology. After 5 to 10 years of study to obtain a master's degree or a PhD, lecturers have accumulated a lot of theoretical knowledge, but they do not necessarily have any ministerial skills or experience. When lecturers are appointed at higher education institution faculties of theology only on academic grounds, without any ministerial experience, something is missing in the tutoring. However, different disciplines and various lecturers may present distinct approaches to the relationship and integration of theory and practice. Ott describes 4 distinct approaches regarding this relationship. The first is a theory application model. In this model, truth as a propositional statement established by sound biblical theology or study is established and then applied to a specific topic and or context. The second can be called a pragmatic theory. In this case, truth is what works in practice. The theory emerges from the observation of current practices. The third is what I call an historical interpretation model. In this instance, past theories and practices are explored to have a clearer understanding of current realities. Here, truth is then the accurate description and understanding of past realities. The fourth, and this is our concern, is educational. How theory and practice are integrated in the teaching and learning process. When we integrate theory and practice in theological education, it is called praxis. This is the difference between education and teaching about something or from within. Naidu describes the traditional curriculum as an unilateral theory to application method, with theory being more important than practice. To make clear his understanding and the importance of praxis, Ott makes use of Groom's book, Christian Religious Education of 1980. After discussing the Hebrew term yada, which refers to knowing more by intentional engagement in lived experience, or knowing from the heart more than the mind, or meaning not by standing back from it in order to look at, but by active and intentional engagement in lived experience, or meaning involving a response of the total person, or entering into a relationship and ultimately obedience to God's will. He claims the biblical way of knowing, yada, can be called praxis epistemology. Praxis then refers to the whole life and reflective engagement in a social institution, to attitudes, values, virtues, and character. The deduction then is that the praxis of theological education is more than teaching different practices. Theological education praxis then means more than simply teaching the skills and competences for leadership, for conducting worship service, for preparing a sermon, or for competence and performance as a counselor. Praxis refers to our very being, our habits, which in turn shape everything we are and we do. From this point of view, the dichotomy of theory and praxis are redundant. Theorizing is part of praxis and not the prerequisite thereof. And I quote the mentioning. As a missiologist, I would argue in terms of the Missio Dei. When we are busy with theological education, we are privileged to participate in what God is busy doing in this world. Teachers have the privilege to be participants. They are not the main actors or the initiators. That role belongs to the Trinitarian God in his love for this world. Freire in 2005 defines praxis in terms of transformation, since it is more than action and includes reflection. He states, human activity consists of action and reflection. It is praxis. It is transformation of the world. And as praxis, it requires theory to eliminate it. Human activity is theory and practice. It is reflection and action. Praxis then is the embodied integration of theory and practice in the lives of theologians, both students and lecturers. From the above, it is clear that theological education and spiritual formation are not independent, but rather interdependent. I argued in a paper of mine that spiritual formation is done best in partnership between the church and the theological education institution. This happens when the education information is presented in such a way that it leads to formation, and where spiritual formation leads to a quest for more information, to a better self-understanding. Excuse me. If we now come to the fourth industrial revolution, we must be aware that even before, but especially since COVID-19, the term fourth industrial revolution has become part of our daily conversations. Before COVID-19, the discussion was on the possible influence of the fourth industrial revolution on theological education. And how must we prepare to engage with this revolution? However, since COVID-19, the Church has realized that it's not only an industrial revolution, but also a communication revolution. The question is thus no longer on the possible influence, but rather on how to use it to the benefit of the communication of the gospel. Oliver, 2021, also describes the fourth industrial revolution as the fourth communication revolution. The first communication revolution would then be language, the second writing, the third printing, and the fourth technological-driven communication. The fourth industrial revolution is indeed characterized by a fusion of technologies that blur the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. It is thus clear that the fourth industrial revolution will have a clear impact also on theology and spirituality, not only regarding communication, but also spiritual formation. One of the regular questions asked by churches and theological institutions regarding technology-driven education is whether it can contribute to spiritual formation. During COVID-19, all higher education institutions in South Africa changed their mode from face-to-face teaching to online teaching. Online teaching had many positive and negative influences on theological education in South Africa as well as Africa, creating new opportunities and challenges. Some of the opportunities it created was that local churches could get more directly involved in theological education through offering their uncapped data to students in the vicinity. Ministers from rural areas could suddenly attend some online courses as part of continuous education, which was not previously a possibility because of distance and time. Many difficult or relevant topics that were created by COVID-19 forced theological faculties of higher education to give guidance online for pastors in local congregations. However, this also reveals the great inequality in South Africa and more broadly in Africa and the rest of the world. In two articles that I mentioned in the paper, confirm that many people from the majority world do not have access to data and therefore the different forms of technology-driven communication. This has the implication that in a context of total lockdown, these people do not have any form of communication with the outside world. This has also influenced many theological education institutions negatively, especially in Africa and other parts of the majority world, to the point where some of them had to close. Let's look at a few lessons from history. When dealing with contentious matters like theological education, it is always enriching to be aware of what history may teach us. Without going into too much detail, I want to mention a few lessons, some of which have already been alluded to in this article. The first one may be called the wineskin factor. From the Gospels, it is well known that you cannot put new wine in an old wineskin. Theological education may not be confined to any wineskin, although, according to Hebrews 1:3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being. Close the quote. We still discover God in new ways every day. There are always new people, new contexts, new understandings, although old structures and traditions seldom die off completely. A second lesson from history is a varus for power and money. In many instances, theological training institutions, Bible schools and colleges included, as well as faculties at higher education institutions, started off with a clear focus on accessibility and transformation of society. But soon they become preoccupied with status, money and power. The criteria used to be a good theological institution has to do with avarice. Unfortunately, the latter is also manifesting in churches in Africa. A third lesson we must learn is that God is more diverse than we can ever imagine. He is calling people in various contexts, example, institutions, to be His servants, whether in ministry, teaching, or as lay people. Therefore, it is important to always evaluate new structures and ideas considering a broadly ecumenical and evangelical theology with a clear focus on the Trinitarian God. Lesson 4 from history is the importance of the laity. Theological education must always have a clear focus on the laity, whether it is equipping the laity for their ministry or whether it is to equip people for professional ministry. All people are called to participate in the Mission Day. But how does theological education help them to become better servants and participants in God's mission? A fifth lesson history taught us regarding theological education is to have a clear focus on the youth. Many of the mission movements and orders were founded by young men and women, not by seasoned church leaders. This focus is true in the majority world, where the majority population is younger than 30 years of age. But it is also true in Europe, where the population is aging. The global church needs to recognize that the youth is not the church of tomorrow. They are today's church and therefore need to be properly equipped as believers. The last lesson I want to mention is that the story of biblical theology is the story of suffering. Our theology is built on the suffering servant, the one who died, but also the one who has raised from death. Our theology is a theology with a focus on those who suffer and on a broken world, but our theology is also a theology of hope, of transformed society, of a new life in Christ, and where we see such glimpses of God's kingdom on earth, joy triumphs over the suffering. When we are talking about theological education and planning our curriculums for new and different contexts, may these lessons give us guidance and hope so that we may work with love from our faith in the Trinitarian God. In conclusion, the article reviewed the challenges and opportunities of theological education in Africa in light of the impact of COVID-19 and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. First, it attended to the methodological aspects of our curriculum, which included missional hermeneutics and paradigm shifts. Second, it looked at human-centered awareness, and thirdly, the very personal nature of theological education. Although the latter underlies the whole article, it especially came forth in the section that deals with theory, practice and praxis, as well as in the Fourth Industrial Revolution section of the paper. All three of these focuses are also informed by lessons from history. The most important principle we need to remember is that theological education belongs to God. Wright and Bosch stated that God's mission has a church, and may I add, God's church has theological education. I thank you. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this paper, and I want to invite you to contact me for further discussion on this paper. I would really enjoy it if you contact me. Thank you so much for your time and listening to the paper. Stay safe.